The global consciousness remembers Freddie Mercury as an untouchable titan, permanently frozen in his 1985 Live Aid prime. The actual historical record of his final years, however, details a drastically different reality. Offstage, the most powerful frontman in rock was actively hunted by the British tabloid press like a fugitive. To protect him from a terminal medical crisis and the vicious social hostility of the era, the remaining members of Queen mobilized their resources to engineer the most extensive corporate cover-up in music history. London, 1987, marked a definitive turning point in the operational history of Queen. The British music industry operated on a ruthless, highly visible cycle of album releases, followed immediately by massive stadium tours. Queen had just concluded the monumental Magic Tour in the summer of 1986, cementing their status as the most bankable live act in the world. However, the corporate machinery behind the band suddenly and inexplicably ground to a halt. Frontman Freddie Mercury issued a private directive to their management team, ceasing all future live touring commitments permanently. This sudden operational shift triggered immediate aggressive suspicion across Fleet Street newsrooms. During this era, a terminal immune deficiency diagnosis was the equivalent of a sudden total erasure from public life. The mid-1980s socio-political climate in the United Kingdom was deeply hostile toward individuals suffering from the epidemic. The government and public institutions offered little support, and the mainstream press actively fueled a narrative of fear and moral panic. A positive test did not just mean physical decline. It guaranteed immediate social isolation, the termination of commercial contracts, and ruthless public shaming. For a global icon sitting at the apex of the entertainment industry, going public with such a verdict meant the instant destruction of a carefully built corporate empire. Medical timelines confirm that Mercury received his official diagnosis around Easter of 1987. The confirmation came following a physical biopsy of a small, localized skin lesion on his shoulder, which specialists identified as Kaposi's sarcoma. Faced with a terminal verdict, Mercury made a calculated decision to compartmentalize the information entirely. He disclosed the medical reality only to a heavily vetted inner circle: his partner Jim Hutton, former girlfriend Mary Austin, and Queen's manager Jim Beach. He deliberately withheld the diagnosis from his founding bandmates Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon, forcing them to operate under a veil of manufactured ignorance. The British tabloid press, backed by massive corporate publishing conglomerates, sensed vulnerability and immediately deployed their resources. The Sun, the News of the World, and the Daily Mirror operated on a business model that demanded scandalous headlines to drive daily circulation. Fleet Street viewed Mercury strictly as a high-value asset. His physical decline was a commodity guaranteed to generate millions in daily newspaper sales. Editors dispatched teams of photographers and freelance informants to establish a permanent perimeter around Mercury's primary residence. Garden Lodge, a sprawling Georgian-style villa in Kensington, was rapidly transformed from a private sanctuary into a heavily besieged fortress. The tactics utilized by these media operatives were relentless, highly invasive, and entirely legal under the lax privacy laws of the era. Paparazzi set up permanent encampments on Logan Place, the quiet street outside the residence, maintaining a 24-hour surveillance operation. They utilized long-range telephoto lenses to shoot through the upper-story windows, attempting to capture any visible signs of physical deterioration. When ground-level surveillance failed, press agencies rented industrial cherry pickers to elevate photographers over the estate's high brick walls. Reporters routinely bribed local municipal workers to secure access to the property's refuse, sifting through trash bags for discarded prescription bottles or medical documents. Brian May later adopted the term harpies to describe the media operatives hunting his frontman. The guitarist found himself increasingly forced into the role of a physical and verbal enforcer against the press. Whenever the band attempted to conduct standard business, they were met by aggressive throngs of photographers demanding answers about Mercury's health. May frequently engaged in tense, expletive-laden standoffs with reporters outside studios and private events, desperately trying to deflect the narrative. The band's public relations strategy was reduced to a singular, repetitive tactic: flatly deny every allegation regardless of the mounting visual evidence to the contrary. Inside the corporate structure of Queen Productions Limited, the strain of maintaining this massive cover-up began to fracture the working environment. The band reconvened at Townhouse Studios in London and Mountain Studios in Montreux in early 1988 to record the album The Miracle. The physical reality of Mercury's condition could no longer be hidden from his bandmates behind closed doors. His signature stamina was severely depleted, and his physical appearance was visibly altering. Despite the obvious decline, the band maintained a strict code of silence, refusing to interrogate him about his health, waiting for Mercury to initiate the conversation on his own terms. Mercury possessed a fiercely guarded sense of personal pride, forged during his early years in strict boarding schools in India. He harbored an absolute uncompromising refusal to be viewed as a victim or subjected to public pity. He understood that admitting weakness would invite the exact type of media dissection he despised. Therefore, he dragged himself to the studio sessions, utilizing heavy layers of makeup and oversized clothing to mask his severe weight loss. The contrast between the Vibra NT untouchable god of the 1985 Live Aid stage and the frail man recording vocals in 1988 was staggering. Yet the band continued to operate as if nothing had changed. The logistics of managing his medical care required a clandestine operation that rivaled government intelligence work. Medications, including early experimental treatments, were procured under false names and routed through secure, untraceable channels. Medical professionals were smuggled into Garden Lodge under the cover of darkness, or disguised as standard service personnel to avoid tipping off the paparazzi stationed outside. Every piece of medical waste had to be carefully incinerated or disposed of off-site to prevent reporters from pulling it from the municipal trash. The entire management team was bound by strict non-disclosure agreements, understanding that a single leak could destroy the perimeter they had built. Eventually, the pressure of the unspoken truth became entirely unsustainable for the internal dynamics of the band. During a private meeting in Montreux, Mercury finally laid the facts out plainly for May, Taylor, and Deacon. He confirmed the terminal nature of his illness, explicitly stated he did not want to discuss it further, and demanded they focus entirely on recording as much music as possible before his physical collapse. The band's reaction was immediate and unified. They formalized a strategy to completely close ranks. From that moment forward, Queen operated as an impenetrable vault, actively lying to the global press to protect their frontman's remaining time on Earth. However, the greatest threat to Mercury's carefully constructed fortress did not come from the photographers waiting outside his walls. It came from deep within his own highly restricted inner circle. Paul Prenter had served as Mercury's personal manager, confidant, and constant companion throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Prenter possessed intimate, comprehensive knowledge of Mercury's private life, high as secretive relationships, and the lifestyle habits that the band had spent millions of dollars hiding from the public eye. After being terminated from the payroll in 1986 following a series of disastrous professional decisions, Prenter found himself alienated, bitter, and entirely out of funds. On May 4th, 1987, the protective perimeter around Freddie Mercury was catastrophically breached. Recognizing the immense financial value of the secrets he held, Paul Prenter brokered a highly lucrative deal with the Sun newspaper, allegedly receiving £32,000 for his exclusive cooperation. Across a serialized, multi-page spread, Prenter systematically dismantled Mercury's public image, detailing his private romantic encounters and exposing the illicit habits of his inner circle. Most devastatingly, Prenter publicly named two of Mercury's former associates, who had recently succumbed to the same immune deficiency illness. This calculated, financially motivated betrayal provided Fleet Street with the exact ammunition they needed, instantly escalating the paparazzi siege into an uncontrollable high-stakes hunt for the ultimate tragic headline. Following the catastrophic leak by Paul Prenter in May 1987, Queen Productions Limited immediately transitioned into a hostile defensive posture. Manager Jim Beach authorized a massive coordinated campaign of active misinformation to neutralize the tabloid narrative. Official press releases were drafted detailing fictitious recording schedules, fabricated exhaustion, and non-existent vocal cord injuries. The strategy was no longer about simply ignoring the press. It was about feeding them deliberate falsehoods to protect the principal asset. This calculated deception required the absolute compliance of every technician, accountant, and security contractor on the payroll. The financial logistics of maintaining this level of corporate secrecy were staggering. The band's management team systematically bought out hotel floors, utilized private aviatio, and strictly operating out of remote airstrips and heavily restricted access to their recording facilities. Non-disclosure agreements were aggressively enforced, with immediate termination and severe legal threats. For any staff member caught communicating with reporters, millions in potential touring revenue were permanently sacrificed to fund this closed-circuit operation. Queen ceased being a traditional rock band and morphed into a highly secure, private intelligence operation dedicated to hiding one man's medical chart. Brian May rapidly assumed the role of the band's primary enforcer and public shield. The guitarist understood that any crack in their unified front would result in a total media feeding frenzy. May deliberately scheduled solo promotional appearances and interviews, fully aware he was serving as bait for the tabloid press. When reporters inevitably cornered him to demand answers about Mercury's declining physical state, May deployed flat, aggressive denials. He looked veteran journalists directly in the eye and lied with absolute, uncompromising conviction to secure his frontman's safety. These confrontations routinely escalated past verbal sparring into near-physical altercations on the streets of London. During promotional runs in 1989, May repeatedly clashed with photographers attempting to breach the band's security details. He later admitted in a 2021 broadcast that the band had completely closed ranks, treating the press as hostile invaders. Every public statement was heavily vetted to ensure it contained no discrepancies that the tabloids could exploit. May absorbed the brunt of the media's hostility, acting as a human barricade so Mercury could remain isolated behind the reinforced gates of Garden Lodge. Inside that isolation, the physical reality of the terminal illness was advancing with devastating speed. The virus systematically dismantled Mercury's immune system, leaving him vulnerable to severe secondary complications. The Kaposi's sarcom, lesions initially isolated to his shoulder, began to aggressively spread across his body. Severe weight loss became impossible to conceal, stripping away the muscular physique that had defined his stadium tours. To combat the visible deterioration, his personal staff procured oversized, heavily tailored clothing designed to drape over his shrinking frame and mask the skeletal reality underneath. Mercury's personal pride dictated that he project an image of absolute control, even as his biological functions failed. He refused mobility aids, demanding to walk unaided regardless of the immense physical pain it caused him. The internal band dynamic shifted radically during this period. May, Taylor, and Deacon stopped questioning the frontman's erratic schedule and simply adapted to it. If Mercury had the strength to record for 20 minutes on a Tuesday, the entire corporate machine mobilized instantly to facilitate that brief window. They asked no questions, offered no unsolicited sympathy, and strictly focused on the work. This unspoken agreement was tested to its absolute limits during a private dinner among the band members. In a grim moment of unfiltered reality, the manufactured normalcy collapsed entirely. Mercury, seated with his oldest colleagues, suddenly removed his footwear to reveal the horrific extent of his physical decline. A severe localized infection related to his condition had essentially necrotized a massive portion of his foot. The physical damage was extensive, irreversible, and visually shocking to the men who had shared stages with him for 2 decades. Confronted with the visceral horror of the illness, Mercury immediately issued an apology to his bandmates. He expressed regret for upsetting them, prioritizing their emotional comfort over his own agonizing reality. May, recounting the incident in 2017, detailed the absolute devastation of that specific moment. The guitarist informed Mercury that his only source of distress was the undeniable fact that his friend had to endure such terrible, unmanageable pain. The severity of the foot condition made it painfully clear that their timeline was rapidly accelerating toward a definitive conclusion. Despite the missing tissue and severe nerve damage, Mercury absolutely refused to halt the production schedule. The physical act of standing became an ordeal that required heavy reliance on prescription painkillers and sheer willpower. Studio engineers modified vocal booths with padded leaning posts so Mercury could distribute his weight off his ruined foot. The band operated with clinical efficiency during these sessions, never drawing attention to the specialized accommodations. The muses became a critical distraction, the only remaining space where Mercury could exercise total control over his environment. By the winter of 1989, the tabloid speculation had reached a fever pitch, fueled by Mercury's absolute absence from the public eye. Rival bands were launching massive global tours, yet the biggest act in Britain remained completely off the road. The Sun published daily countdowns, openly demanding proof of life and speculating on imminent funeral arrangements. Queen's management realized that total silence was inadvertently confirming the rumors they were desperately trying to deny. A strategic decision was made to execute a highly controlled public appearance to temporarily derail the press narrative. The British phonographic industry had selected Queen to receive the Outstanding Contribution to Music honor at the 1990 Brit Awards. Management viewed this televised ceremony as the perfect vehicle to project a false image of stability and unity. The logistical planning for this single evening required weeks of intense preparation and severe security protocols. Every variable of the Dominion Theatre in London was analyzed to minimize Mercury's physical exertion and prevent unauthorized photography. They secured a private entrance, heavily restricted backstage access. Jiren briefed a specialized security detail to form a physical wall around the band. The physical preparation required to get Freddie Mercury stage ready on February 18, 1990, was a grueling ordeal. Makeup artists spent hours applying heavy theatrical-grade cosmetics to conceal the pronounced lesions and severe pallor of his skin. He was dressed in a meticulously tailored powder blue suit, specifically cut to hide the drastic reduction in his body mass. The entire process was designed to create an optical illusion for the television cameras broadcasting to millions. However, no amount of bespoke tailoring could hide the fundamental absence of vitality in the man who had once commanded Wembley Stadium. When Queen took the stage to accept the award, the tension in the room was palpable and immediate. The industry executives and fellow musicians in the audience were confronted with a jarring, undeniable reality. Mercury, typically the dominant focal point of any broadcast, stood entirely static in the background. His posture was rigid, his face gaunt, and his physical presence severely diminished. He let Brian May handle the entirety of the acceptance speech, stepping forward only at the absolute end of the broadcast. The frontman leaned into the microphone and delivered a brief four-word statement to the audience. "Thank you, good night." His voice, previously capable of shattering arena sound systems, was thin, breathless, and shockingly frail. It was a stark clinical confirmation of the exact rumors the band had spent 3 years aggressively denying. The television cameras captured the undeniable truth, broadcasting it directly into millions of living rooms across the United Kingdom. The calculated PR strategy of active misinformation collapsed entirely within the span of a 10-second television clip. The fallout from the Brit Awards appearance was immediate, brutal, and entirely unmanageable for Queen's security apparatus. Fleet Street editors scrapped their schedule, front pages replacing them with high-definition stills of Mercury's gaunt face. The following morning, every major newspaper in the country led with the exact same undeniable conclusion. The carefully constructed wall of lies that May, Taylor, and Deacon had maintained was completely obliterated by the visual evidence. The band had inadvertently provided the tabloid press with the ultimate, indisputable proof they had been hunting for since 1987. The media siege surrounding Garden Lodge instantly doubled in intensity following the broadcast. Reporters no longer asked questions. They shouted demands for a full public medical disclosure. The harpies Brian May despised sensed critical vulnerability, and the perimeter was completely overrun. Management immediately canceled all subsequent public appearances, realizing that further exposure would only accelerate the media feeding frenzy. The band was forced into an immediate emergency retreat to secure the final stages of their operation. It became abundantly clear that London was entirely compromised as a secure operating base. The sheer volume of paparazzi scaling the walls and blocking the streets made daily transit to recording studios impossible. Every medical professional entering the property was aggressively pursued and harassed by reporters demanding confidential health records. The stress of the permanent siege was visibly accelerating Mercury's physical decline, severely impacting his limited remaining stamina. A radical geographical shift was required to salvage what little time he had left to finalize his vocal tracks. Queen Productions Limited activated a contingency plan to relocate their entire studio operation out of the United Kingdom. They owned Mountain Studios in Montreux, Switzerland, a facility nestled deep in the Alps and entirely isolated from the British tabloid apparatus. Moving a terminally ill man across international borders required securing private airspace and paying exorbitant sums to bypass standard customs protocols, medical equipment, heavy pain management medications, and specialized staff had to be quietly smuggled into the Swiss canton. The band abandoned their home country entirely to finish their final project in heavily guarded exile. Brian May assumed total control of the logistical transfer. Ensuring Mercury's comfort was the absolute priority during the grueling transit. The band essentially barricaded themselves inside the Swiss facility, locking the heavy studio doors against the outside world. The pristine, isolated environment of Lake Geneva offered a stark contrast to the aggressive, hostile war zone they had left behind in Kensington. Here, they stripped away the remaining PR lies and faced the cold, undeniable facts of their situation. There were no more award shows, no more press releases, and absolutely no more time for denial. Inside Mountain Studios, the definitive final chapter of Queen's original lineup commenced with ruthless efficiency. The medical chart dictated the studio schedule entirely, reducing their legendary marathon sessions to frantic, hour-long sprints. Mercury was failing fast, relying heavily on prescribed interventions just to remain conscious in front of the microphone. In the final weeks of 1990, the band locked down the vocal booth, fully aware that the man standing behind the glass was actively approaching the end of his physical capacity. The resulting sessions would produce the final unvarnished evidence of his existence, pushing the band into a harrowing technical and psychological ordeal that would alter their legacy forever. Inside the heavy soundproof doors of Mountain Studios, the corporate reality of Queen's operation shifted abruptly from musical production to terminal management. The recording facility, situated on the edge of Lake Geneva in Montreux, had previously served as a high-end playground for the band's excesses during the late 1970s. By the winter of 1990, the space was effectively converted into a highly classified, heavily guarded clinical environment. The sprawling control room, once packed with entourage members and industry executives, was strictly locked down to a handful of essential personnel. The atmosphere inside the facility was heavy, dictated entirely by the severe limitations of a frontman whose biological systems were actively failing. The daily operational schedule was completely dismantled and aggressively rebuilt around Mercury's heavily restricted medical chart. Standard recording sessions in the rock industry routinely stretched for 12 to 15 uninterrupted hours. In Montreux, the production team was granted a maximum operating window of merely 1 to 2 hours per day. Mercury required extensive physical preparation and heavy pharmaceutical intervention simply to endure the short transit from his local accommodation to the studio floor. Once inside the vocal booth, the physical exertion of standing in front of the microphone rapidly depleted his remaining energy reserves. Queen Productions Limited operated as a massive corporate entity bound by strict international delivery contracts with EMI Records. The label executives demanded a commercial product, completely unaware of the fatal crisis unfolding inside the Swiss facility. The band's management deliberately falsified progress reports, shielding the corporate executives from the reality that their primary vocal asset was collapsing. Brian May and Roger Taylor carried the immense legal and financial burden of ensuring the album was delivered to prevent a catastrophic breach of contract. This intense corporate pressure compounded the grim, unavoidable reality of the recording sessions. The physical environment of the studio required heavy manipulation to stabilize Mercury's failing biological systems. Industrial heating units were brought into the recording space to combat the frontman's sudden inability to regulate his own body temperature. Auxiliary oxygen canisters were tagged discreetly in the corners of the control room, ready for immediate deployment when his respiratory system faltered. The engineering staff operated under strict orders to maintain a sterile, perfectly controlled atmosphere at all times. Any introduction of external pathogens into the facility could trigger a fatal secondary infection, instantly terminating the project and the frontman. The vocal booth required immediate physical modifications to accommodate his severe muscular atrophy. Mercury could no longer support his own body weight for the duration of a standard vocal take. Studio engineers strategically positioned heavy-duty leaning posts and stabilized the main mixing console to serve as structural supports. Mercury would physically brace himself against the heavy analog desk, locking his arms straight to keep his skeletal torso upright. This rigid, forced posture allowed him to push air from his severely weakened diaphragm up through his deteriorating vocal cords. The technical degradation of Mercury's primary instrument was stark and undeniable on the master tapes. His signature operatic range, previously built on massive lung capacity and extreme muscular control, was systematically dismantled by the illness. The resulting vocal tracks captured during these sessions exhibited a fundamentally thinner frequency and a highly fragile tone. Audio engineers monitoring the isolated feeds were confronted with a jarring auditory reality, the sound of a man struggling to draw sufficient oxygen. This severe physical deficit forced May into a radical reevaluation of his entire production strategy. May was forced to abandon standard recording protocols entirely, adopting a fragmented, highly tedious production method. Mercury simply lacked the sustained stamina to perform a complete song from beginning to end. The guitars had to break down complex vocal arrangements into isolated microscopic segments. Mercury would execute a few lines, occasionally just a single PT, phrase, before physical exhaustion mandated an immediate halt to the recording. May then face the grueling technical challenge of utilizing analog tape splicing to construct a cohesive performance from these shattered fragments. The post-production process became an exercise in audio forensic reconstruction. May spent countless hours hunched over the tape machine, utilizing razor blades to manually cut and splice the magnetic tape. He had to locate the exact milliseconds between Mercury's strained breaths to seamlessly join two disparate takes. The engineering team employed heavy compression and equalization techniques, desperately attempting to artificially boost the frequencies the frontman could no longer generate organically. The mixing sessions devolved into a desperate audio rescue operation, meticulously engineered to mask a collapsing biological system. The psychological atmosphere within the control room operated on a strict, heavily enforced policy of manufactured ignorance. May, Taylor, and Deacon collectively agreed to never verbally acknowledge the terminal reality of the situation while the tape was rolling. They treated the fragmented, agonizing sessions as standard operational procedure, discussing minor equalization adjustments and vocal pitch, as if preparing for a global tour. This forced normalcy provided Mercury with a critical, undeniable psychological anchor. The rigorous routine of the studio served as his final remaining tether to his professional identity. The band's refusal to confront the medical facts allowed Mercury to maintain a grueling work ethic long past his logical physical limits. For the frontman, the recording process ceased to be about commercial output and became a stark method of psychological survival. Maintaining the illusion of an active rock band gave him a tangible reason to tolerate the aggressive medical treatments necessary to keep him conscious. The resulting tracks from this era, eventually released on the Innuendo album, carry the undeniable audio signature of this desperation. Dedicated listeners immediately recognize the severe structural shift in his delivery, noting the raw, unpolished urgency masking the technical decline. When the Innuendo album was finalized in early 1991, the accompanying promotional materials required extensive visual manipulation to hide the truth. Mercury was too frail to film standard music videos, forcing the production company to utilize complex animation and heavily edited archival footage. In the rare instances he appeared on camera, the footage was shot in high-contrast black and white to hide his severe jaundice. Directors utilized heavy lighting and specific camera angles to obscure the hollowed-out structure of his skull. The severe visual discrepancy between the aggressive audio tracks and the heavily doctored video footage fueled immense public suspicion across the British press. The most extreme test of Mercury's physical and technical endurance occurred during the tracking of The Show Must Go On in late 1990. The composition featured a massive, demanding melody line that required peak diaphragm strength and immense breath control. Upon reviewing the demo, May formally expressed doubt regarding Mercury's biological capacity to hit the required high notes. The vocal demand was theoretically impossible for a patient in the advanced stages of severe immune collapse. Mercury perceived the warning as a direct challenge to his remaining professional authority. The frontman's response was swift, reckless, and highly effective. He bypassed all standard vocal warm-ups, consumed a heavy measure of clear liquor, and marched directly into the isolation booth. Bracing his frame against the console, Mercury forcefully pushed past his physical limitations and delivered the vocal in a single, devastating take. He struck the highest registers with sheer, unadulterated force, deliberately straining his remaining vocal cords to secure the track. It was a taut expenditure of his remaining physical stamina, captured permanently on magnetic tape. Following the completion of the Innuendo tracks, the medical timeline accelerated beyond the band's ability to compensate. As the calendar turned to the spring of 1991, Mercury demanded the operation continue, pushing for the creation of what would eventually become the Made in Heaven album. The workflow deteriorated from organized sessions into frantic, desperate attempts to archive anything he could vocalize. May was forced to write lyrics on the spot, scribbling hastily on torn scraps of paper inside the control room. He would slide these physical notes to Mercury, instructing him to track the vocals immediately before the melody was even finalized. The sessions devolved into a bleak routine of capturing 3 rapid passes of each raw, unrefined vocal line. There was no time for critical review, no luxury of alternative phrasing, and no opportunity for the frontman to learn the material. Mercury simply absorbed the lyrics, fired them into the microphone, and immediately requested the next sheet of paper. The urgency was palpable. The man behind the glass was acutely aware that his biological clock was measured in weeks. He operated like a machine, running on auxiliary power, desperate to offload its final data before total system failure. This clinical, high-speed archiving process culminated in mid-May 1991 during the recording of the track Mother Love. The session was grueling, marked by a severe drop in Mercury's physical stability and an inability to maintain his core temperature. The vocal performance captured that afternoon was completely stripped of his usual theatricality, leaving only a hollow, highly exposed frequency. May fed him the lyrics line by line, watching the frontman physically struggle to force the words past his failing respiratory system. The track represented the absolute limit of what the human body could endure while actively shutting down. Approaching the final verse of Mother Love, the manufactured illusion of the studio finally and permanently shattered. Mercury, mid-phrase, abruptly pulled away from the microphone and looked directly at the production desk. Without warning, he informed May that his physical reserves were entirely depleted and abruptly stated he would return the following day to finish the track. Mercury walked out of the heavy studio doors, left the Swiss facility, and immediately boarded a flight back to London. The frontman never returned to the microphone, abandoning the sessions permanently and leaving Brian May utterly isolated with a vault of unfinished tapes and the terrifying reality of a band that had just ceased to exist. The abrupt departure of Freddie Mercury in May 1991 left Queen Productions Limited in a state of operational paralysis. The frontman had evacuated the Swiss canton and secured himself inside his London fortress, severing all direct communication with the studio facility. Brian May remained isolated in Montreux, staring at a mountain of unspooled magnetic tape and severely fragmented audio files. The corporate reality was absolute. EMI Records held legally binding contracts demanding a completed commercial product. May was suddenly burdened with the massive logistical and technical responsibility of constructing an entire album without a lead vocalist. The immediate crisis centered on the unfinished master track for Mother Love. The analog tape contained the final recorded frequencies of Mercury's life, but the structural arrangement was critically incomplete. The final verse was missing entirely, leaving a glaring, unmanageable void in the digital session file. May analyzed the isolated vocal stem through the studio monitors, stripping away the instrumental backing to expose the raw data. The acoustic reality of the recording was jarring, capturing the undeniable sound of severe respiratory failure and rapid physical collapse. To fulfill the contractual requirements of the composition, May was forced to take unprecedented operational action. The guitarist walked into the vocal booth, stood directly in front of the microphone abandoned by his frontman, and tracked the missing final verse himself. The resulting audio edit on the final master tape presents a stark, undeniable transition. Listeners are subjected to the sudden shift from Mercury's failing fragile delivery to May's stable, functional vocal cords. It stands as a permanent clinical audio document of the exact moment the band's original lineup ceased to function. The subsequent production phase for what would become the Made in Heaven album required a grueling, multi-year audio forensic operation. The remaining members of Queen reconvened in 1993, long after the immediate media fallout of Mercury's passing had settled. They were tasked with exhuming the incomplete vocal stems archived during the Montreux sessions and building massive instrumental arrangements around them. The technical process demanded immense precision, as the original vocal takes were never recorded to a standard click track or locked tempo. The band had to reverse engineer their entire rhythm section to match the erratic, failing cadence of the original analog files. This reverse engineering process placed an immense psychological strain on the surviving members, particularly May. He assumed the primary role of audio editor, locking himself inside the control room for consecutive weeks. The technical work required him to listen to the isolated vocal tracks on an endless, repetitive loop. He was forced to focus intently on the micro details of Mercury's voice, isolating breaths, strained syllables, and vocal breaks. The studio environment essentially transformed into an audio vault, trapping May in a closed loop with the isolated data of his deceased colleague. May later detailed the severe operational hazards of this specific production environment during a 2022 broadcast on BBC Radio. He described the editing process as fundamentally traumatizing, requiring him to maintain a clinical detachment that frequently failed. The audio clarity of the master tapes created a jarring psychological illusion inside the control room. May would construct a perfect vocal splice, instinctively turn toward the booth to seek approval, and be slammed by the empty physical space. The work required him to constantly confront the permanent absence of the frontman while aggressively manipulating his surviving recordings. The corporate executives at the record label exerted significant pressure on the production team to deliver a flawless, highly polished commercial product. The mid-1990s marked the advent of early digital pitch correction and advanced equalization algorithms. Industry standards dictated that any vocal imperfections, pitch variations, or audible breathing should be scrubbed from the final mix to ensure radio viability. The raw, physically compromised nature of Mercury's final takes directly violated these established commercial protocols. The label wanted the invincible stadium rock god, not the strained, struggling audio of a terminal patient. Queen Productions Limited instituted a strict, uncompromising directive regarding the treatment of the vocal stems. They completely rejected all corporate demands for artificial enhancement or digital pitch correction. May, Taylor, and Deacon mandated that the original files remain structurally intact, preserving every flaw, every strained note, and every desperate breath. They refused to run the audio through corrective software to manufacture a false sense of stability. The band made a calculated decision to release a technically imperfect product rather than falsify the historical record of Mercury's final days. The resulting album stands as a forensic document rather than a standard commercial release. The final tracks completely abandon the impenetrable front maintained during the late 1980s press siege, exposing the exact internal mechanics of a group scrambling to compensate for a catastrophic failure in their primary system. The instrumentation is massive and heavily layered, deliberately designed to support and elevate the fragile, failing vocal lines. It is an audible representation of the surviving members forming a protective perimeter around the compromised data, while the resulting tracks expose the stark acoustic reality of his failing body. The physical reality back in London was deteriorating at an uncontrollable rate. Following his abrupt extraction from Montreux in the summer of 1991, Mercury's return to Garden Lodge triggered a massive escalation in the estate's security protocols. The perimeter was locked down entirely with a heavily vetted rotation of medical personnel and private security contractors operating on strict non-disclosure agreements. The management team initiated a total communications blackout, severing all contact with the press agencies that had besieged the property for years. The objective was to secure the physical premises and manage the inevitable legal and financial fallout of his impending decline. By November 1991, the internal medical reports indicated imminent biological failure. Mercury permanently ceased all pharmaceutical interventions, refusing the medications that were artificially sustaining his physical functions. The corporate machinery immediately recognized the shift and prepared for the massive public relations crisis that would follow. On November 22nd, the management team drafted a highly controlled, legally vetted public statement confirming his terminal diagnosis. This document was strategically withheld for 24 hours, heavily guarded by the legal department to prevent early leaks to the tabloids. The official press release was deployed to international media outlets on the evening of November 23rd. It was a brief clinical admission of the exact facts they had spent 4 years aggressively denying. The statement confirmed the diagnosis and the resulting immune collapse, asking for public cooperation in fighting the disease. The strategic timing was deliberate, designed to seize control of the narrative from the tabloid editors and establish the official historical record on Queen's own terms. It was the final operational maneuver executed by the management team while the frontman was still officially living. Less than 24 hours after the press release hit the wire, Freddie Mercury suffered total biological failure at his London estate. The timeline of his passing on November 24th immediately triggered a catastrophic breach of the secure perimeter the band had maintained. The moment the medical examiner signed the official documentation, the corporate shield collapsed, exposing the estate to massive external and internal threats. The immediate hours following his passing triggered aggressive legal interventions and ruthless financial maneuvering. The physical security of Garden Lodge was instantly compromised by former associates and peripheral staff members seeking to capitalize on the fatal incident. Unvetted individuals bypassed the security checkpoints, aggressively stripping the property of high-value assets, personal documents, and private files. The press agencies, tipped off by internal leaks, overran the police barricades, transforming the surrounding streets into an unmanageable chaos of satellite trucks and telephoto lenses. The private sanctuary had been successfully breached, turning a secure clinical environment into an active zone of corporate theft and tabloid exploitation. The financial architecture of the estate immediately descended into brutal, heavily litigated warfare. Millions of dollars in current assets, future royalty structures, and the physical deed to the Kensington fortress became the target of aggressive legal filings. Individuals who had been forcefully exiled from the inner circle years prior suddenly resurfaced, deploying aggressive legal counsel to secure unauthorized payotees. The surviving band members were instantly sidelined, forced to watch as the private empire they had violently protected was systematically dismantled and monetized by the exact opportunists Mercury had despised. The swiftness of this internal betrayal highlighted the toxic, transactional nature of the rock industry elite. The loyalty that defined the studio sessions in Montreux did not extend to the sprawling network of assistants, managers, and hangers-on who relied on the frontman for their financial survival. The moment the primary revenue source was terminated, all pretense of loyalty was abandoned in favor of immediate financial extraction. Legal injunctions were filed within hours, freezing bank accounts and locking down physical assets, while the tabloids aggressively published unauthorized details of the will. Brian May and the remaining band members were legally paralyzed during this initial fallout. They held authority over the musical masters and the Queen corporate brand, but they had absolutely zero legal standing regarding Mercury's private estate or personal assets. They were forced to maintain operational silence while the British press ran serialized exposés based on documents stolen directly from the Garden Lodge residence. The media operatives had finally breached the walls, utilizing inside informants to publish the exact medical details and private correspondence the band had spent millions trying to suppress. The ultimate violation of the band's strict code of silence occurred when the official death certificate was illegally acquired and published on the front pages of national newspapers. The document provided clinical undeniable proof of the exact medical complications that caused his demise, effectively overriding the carefully crafted PR narrative. The press utilized the legal document to retroactively analyze every public appearance, every denied rumor, and every aggressive statement issued by the band since 1987. The corporate cover-up was forensically dismantled by the very reporters who had besieged the property, forcing Queen into one final desperate defensive maneuver. The absolute collapse of the media perimeter following November 24th, 1991, forced Queen Productions Limited into an immediate, high-stakes corporate pivot. Brian May and Roger Taylor recognized that a defensive strategy was no longer viable against the predatory tactics of Fleet Street. The tabloid press was actively attempting to define Mercury's entire life through the narrow lens of a scandalous clinical demise. To reclaim control of the narrative, the surviving members decided to launch a massive, highly visible public offensive. They chose to transform their private grief into a highly coordinated global media event that would permanently alter the cultural landscape. The operational blueprint for this offensive materialized as the Freddie Mercury tribute concert for AIDS awareness, scheduled for April 20th, 1992. The chosen venue was Wembley Stadium, the exact site of the band's historic 1985 performance. The logistical scale of the undertaking was unprecedented, requiring the complete mobilization of the global entertainment industry's primary networks. When tickets officially went on sale, the public response was immediate and overwhelming. All 72,000 available tickets were completely exhausted within a matter of hours, despite the band not yet announcing a single guest performer. Managing the internal politics and immense egos of the confirmed lineup required masterclass corporate diplomacy from Queen's management. The roster featured the most volatile and dominant figures of early 1990s rock and pop, including Elton John, David Bowie, George Michael, Metallica, and Guns N' Roses. Tensions were exceptionally high backstage, as rival camps with conflicting corporate sponsorships and personal animosities were forced into the same tight perimeter. May and Taylor acted as the central authority figures, demanding absolute compliance. With the event's singular objective, every artist on the bill was required to strip away their standard stadium theatricality and operate strictly as a component of Queen's collective engine. The global syndication of the broadcast was a massive technical feat executed by an international consortium of television networks. The live feed was successfully transmitted via satellite to over 76 countries, capturing an estimated global audience of over 1 billion viewers. The Wembley event operated as a highly calculated infrastructure project, forcing mainstream media to broadcast the words HIV and AIDS into living rooms where the topics were previously strictly forbidden. The sheer volume of the global audience effectively smashed the media blackout that public health institutions had faced for over a decade. The financial performance of the Wembley event yielded immediate, massive capital to fund a permanent global intervention. The concert generated approximately £20 million in direct revenue through ticket sales, international broadcasting rights, and corporate merchandising contracts. Queen's legal department immediately ring-fenced these funds, creating the Mercury Phoenix Trust to ensure the capital was insulated from external corporate skimming. The charity was engineered to bypass government bureaucracy, distributing funds directly to localized frontline medical initiatives and awareness campaigns worldwide. The trust remains fully operational as a major funding entity well into 2026, driven by the ongoing monetization of the band's archival catalog. The societal impact of the 1992 tribute was fundamentally disruptive to the prevailing socio-political climate. Prior to this event, the mainstream narrative routinely categorized the illness as a localized epidemic, using derogatory terms like the gay plague to isolate victims and justify institutional neglect. By injecting this clinical reality into a hyper-masculine stadium rock environment, Queen forced AEM, massive demographic of traditional rock fans, to confront the disease directly, seeing elite metal acts like Metallica and Guns N' Roses share a stage with pop icons to advocate for medical support, systematically dismantled the traditional barriers of stigma. It marked the precise historical moment the disease was moved out of the shadows of social shame and into the mainstream scientific discourse. Following the global impact of the Wembley concert, the surviving members faced the critical decision of how to manage Queen's ongoing corporate operations. John Deacon chose to systematically withdraw from public life, permanently retiring from the music industry by 1997 due to a complete disillusionment with the commercial apparatus. May and Taylor, however, retained control of Queen Productions Limited, establishing a strict, multi-decade management policy centered on historical preservation. They recognized that their primary duty was no longer producing new content, but fiercely defending the integrity of the existing master tapes. This defensive policy became particularly critical as the music industry entered the digital era of the 21st century. Rival legacy acts routinely authorized the complete digitization and artificial smoothing of their catalogs to maximize streaming algorithms. Tech conglomerates developed advanced software capable of isolating vocal frequencies, allowing labels to clean up flawed historical recordings or create entirely new tracking sessions. Queen's management team enacted a permanent, legally binding directive that strictly prohibited the use of these corrective tools on Mercury's vocal archives. They chose to maintain a standard of absolute analog fidelity, prioritizing historical accuracy over artificial modern perfection. By 2026, the legacy music market relies heavily on digital clones and AI-generated holograms to monetize deceased icons. Queen's management continues to aggressively reject these corporate proposals. The Made in Heaven Master T apes remain permanently sealed against any digital manipulation. May and Taylor recognized that smoothing out Mercury's vocal flaws would sanitize the historical record. The enduring commercial power of Queen's catalog stems directly from this unvarnished reality. They chose to preserve the exact auditory evidence of a failing biological system, establishing a final, uncompromising defense of their frontman's actual physical limits.